so I'm going to give, you've heard now mentioned in probably at least 3, maybe 4 presentations, the phrase differential privacy. No one has not yet told you what it is. My plan is to give a fairly non-technical introduction to what differential privacy is about and achieves. And then this afternoon, right after lunch, is it Kobe you're going? Kobe will do a more technical and formal introduction to mathematical introduction to differential privacy. All right, so again, the kind of problem that we're trying to address both in this project and also in many places where privacy, other contexts in which privacy is an issue. We have data sets with sensitive information about people, right, collected for a variety of purposes: census, health data, social network activity, the phone records that the NSA has been collecting but seemingly will stop collecting. The question that a lot of research on data privacy is about is how can we enable desirable uses of these kind of data, things that use them for social good, while protecting the privacy of the data subjects. Right? And there's 2 things in quotes here. What is desirable uses? What is privacy? It's worth thinking through what those could mean. They mean different things in different contexts. All right? So desirable uses, of course, the use case that we're most interested in this project is to support scholarly research on human behavior in social science and other fields. But in other contexts, data, for example, census data is useful for informing government policy, in medical research for identifying subjects for a drug trial. And there we may not want to identify a subject when based on incorrect information. NSA and law enforcement may be interested in searching for criminals or terrorists. Companies might be interested in doing market analysis or figuring out someone to serve an ad to. And each of these kinds of different uses they require different things. The methods that you use may support some of these uses but not others. Okay. And then the question is, what does privacy mean? And one can mean also different things by privacy. And differential privacy sort of aims at getting at a particular combination of these 2, which fits nicely with the use case we were interested in supporting scholarly research on human subjects. All right, so it's good to start with some toy or straw man proposals, I guess. Here's a toy medical data set, last name, sex, blood type, and then some even more sensitive information, for example, HIV status. All right, so we've heard in several places, yesterday Michael Barson and I were talking about data tags. One of the policies it produces are policies about how the data should be encrypted. Does it need to be stored in encrypted form? Should it be encrypted when in transit? And Mike also mentioned information security as playing a role in the protection of confidential information. And actually, encryption is something we know how to do really well. If you hear the discussions around after the Snowden disclosures and things that Snowden or other security experts say, they say, well, the one thing we know is that good encryption really works, and that even the NSA can't read your encrypted data if you're using good encryption, not encryption in which they've tried to insert backdoors, but good encryption. So we know how to do this well. So we could imagine encrypting the data set, say encrypting each field here. Why? And then someone who doesn't have the key really has no information about the data, really can't get any information about the values in the data set, even whether 2 values are the same, because good encryption doesn't even, when you encrypt the same value twice, you don't even get the same value. Now, all right, so we know how to do this well. Oftentimes you hear about encryption as a solution to our privacy problems. So Why is it, or why aren't we done? Why do we still have work to do in this project?
How do you get useful data out of it?
How do you get use out of, right, so that's why I started with these two things, right? We want to enable desirable uses while protecting privacy. Okay, so encryption does a great job in protecting privacy, but it doesn't let you do anything with the data unless you have the key to decrypt it. Okay, and well, then we need to share the key if we want to use encrypted data with whoever wants to study this data set. And well, if we trust the people who need to study the data set, then why are we even bothering encrypting it? Just give them the unencrypted data. Okay. So it turns out there are nowadays in cryptography some sort of magical types of encryption schemes that people know how to construct, where you can do some useful computation, actually a lot of very kind of useful computation even on encrypted data, but they turn out not to be in themselves such a great fit for what we're trying to do. But I may mention them later just so you know about these other things. They're not necessarily things that we're looking at in this project. All right, so we talked about the problems there. Another one, very common approach that we've already talked about is trying to anonymize the data, remove obvious identifiers. It looks anonymous, so it's safe to share freely. And I won't repeat, yesterday we talked about it, Micah also mentioned, it turns out that it's often still possible and often quite easy to figure out who's who in an anonymized data set from the information that remains, even though it doesn't look identifying at first glance or looks innocuous. Okay. A third approach, which is also used in practice, is to mediate access to the data. Right? So we won't try to release the data set as a whole, but we'll set up some kind of interface. In this talk, we'll call it, and sometimes in the literature it's called referred to as a curator. This is a computer program or a web application that when people want to study the data set, they will issue queries to this interface. All right, run this regression on the data set for me. Tell me how many people in the data set have the following characteristics, and so on. And they'll get back answers from the interface. Okay. And so now you're not giving people direct access to the data. You're only allowing them to do specific analyses. Why might we still? What problems could go wrong with implementing a curator like this?
Well, a smart enough analyst could probably ask a series of correct questions to get the data they need to cross-reference and have the same issue.
Absolutely. So that's let me. I missed the introduction. So remind me. Your name? Dan. Dan. All right. Great. Thanks, Dan. That's exactly the issue. So, I mean, if you set this up naively, you could even in one query get something. So the query could be how many people in the data set have the last name of Chen, are female, blood type B, and HIV positive. All right. And let's say you knew the sex and blood type, right? So you knew these characteristics. You don't know this one, but your answer, whether it's 0 or 1, tells you the sensitive attribute. Right. And, well, all right, maybe you don't let people ask about names, right? We remove that. Well, from the same reason that we talked about before, by asking queries on the other attributes, you could pull out sensitive information. And then a common approach that's used, maybe you've seen it, we won't give answers that are too small. If we're giving counts, we won't answer if the count is too small. All right, but then this point about making multiple queries becomes an issue. I could ask you 2 counts, each of which is large, but the difference between them will tell me the answer that I'm interested in. Right? So I could say, how many people in the data set are HIV positive, and how many people other than Chen are HIV positive? Right? It doesn't have to be so obvious. Again, it could be using some other attributes. Right? And each of those counts might not be small, but their difference tells me exactly this piece of information I'm interested in. All right, so it becomes a very hard game to think about how can I rule out all possible strategies someone might use by asking cleverly constructed queries to pull out information about individuals in the data set? Okay, and there are some by this line of work on differential privacy started with a paper by Kobe and Irit Denur, which actually showed a kind of a very general result that no matter what you do, if you try to answer too many queries, even randomly chosen queries, too accurately, there's a fundamental barrier that from that point people can start reconstructing huge amounts of information about the individuals in the data set. And so what we need is some theory that tells us how can we design a safe curator? How can we be sure that one that we've designed, whatever controls that we've put in it, are really protecting the individual level information that we want to protect? Right? And that's what differential privacy does. So it provides a theory for how we can be sure that we're protecting individual level information. And the kind of utility, all right, so if we didn't care about the data still being useful, the whole problem would be easy. We don't answer any queries. That's a very safe interface, right? Or we only give encrypted answers, very, very safe. So the kind of utility it's meant to support is statistical analysis of data. And as we'll talk about, at least in theory, it is compatible with doing a huge variety of statistical analyses. All right, and then one other thing that differentiates different approaches to privacy that are studied in computer science is also your trust model. Who do you trust? Right? And so here, in most of the work on differential privacy, and also the way in which we're using it and thinking about it in this project, we have a trusted curator that holds the data. Right now I'm using curator not just to be for the interface, but the whole system that's holding the data and answering the queries. So Dataverse, the repository, is going to have secure servers that are going to sort of field the queries and is trusted to behave properly. I won't talk about these other models, but if you're interested in things related to privacy and security, it's good to know that they exist. In cryptography, there are really beautiful lines of works and amazing things possible with some other choices about what we mean by utility, what we mean by privacy, and what kind of trust model we have. Okay, there are things called secure function evaluation, secure multi-party computation, where you don't need to trust any one person to hold the data. The individuals can just hold their data, and they're going to jointly engage in some computation on all of their data together by going through some kind of protocol of exchanging messages that in themselves don't reveal any useful information, but somehow magically at the end we get the answer to some computation. The winner of an election, where all our private information is our votes, or the winner of an auction, for example. Another one is some variants on encryption, where you imagine one body is holding all the data, but it's holding it in unencrypted form. So you don't need to trust this data holder, the server that's holding the data. Okay? And then what are the kind of utility they support? These things are more general in terms of utility than differential privacy, in that they, in some sense, you can say, I want to support any kind of query. You can specify a query that you want to support, that you want to enable the computation of, and you can design a multi-party protocol for it. Or with, say, functional encryption, I can give reveal a key that allows for computing just that query on the data, on the encrypted data. And the kind of privacy protections they provide is they will say, no one will learn anything other than the result of the query. Okay. So they're really amazing. There's beautiful things possible, but they aren't the closest fit with what we are trying to do here in the project. First, we do again have a trusted curator. Second, they don't really get around, like, what if the query itself reveals too much information about one person? Like the first example we talked about. These lines of work don't address that problem. On the other hand, they do you know, if the kind of query that you want to support is not sort of a statistical population level kind of computation, as we'll see, differential privacy is not won't let you do it. Okay, and we'll maybe come back to that later, and you might need to look at some other approaches. All right, so let's get back to differential privacy. So I mentioned this initial paper of Dinur and Nissim that started the whole line of work, and then with this very striking negative result about the risks that any such interface might present, and the definition was then crystallized in a now standard definitions paper of Dwork, McSherry, Nissim, and Smith. So also one of Kobe's works. So, all right, so what does differential privacy require of this curator? It's a privacy definition, all right? So it's not a utility definition, right? So it will define what we mean by privacy, and then the question will be, what kind of utility can we achieve while satisfying this definition of privacy? And the privacy definition aims to get at the effect of each individual on on what people interacting with the system see should be hidden. Okay, that you should somehow be able to pull out. We may allow you to pull out population level information, right, about the data set as a whole, but the individual level information should be hidden. That's what we want to try to capture. All right, so let's how does this get more precise? So what differential privacy imagines is an adversary interacting with the system in an arbitrary way. All right, so this adversary may be choosing very deviously selected, cleverly chosen queries to try and pull out information that we don't want to leak. And there may even be a specific individual in the data set the adversary is trying to target. Okay, so this person number 2. I only dropped the names because of space. There's no requirement in differential privacy that you have dropped identifying information from the data set. Right? The definition itself will provide all the privacy protection you need. All right, so this specific individual, the adversary is trying to learn something about this one individual. And what differential privacy requires is that this adversary should not be able to tell the difference if I take this individual and change their data arbitrarily, or even remove them from the data set. Okay, so imagine we have this person's actual data, and as a mental experiment, imagine erasing that person's data from the data set and possibly replacing it with arbitrary other values. And to an adversary interacting with the system, shouldn't be able to tell the difference between the real world, where your data is in the data set, and an imaginary world where your data was removed or replaced. Okay, so all right, so how can we achieve such a strong definition? Is this kind of making no assumptions? We want to do this regardless of what data set we have, what other data is in the data set, and for any person, and no matter how much of an outlier they are. Okay, the effect of one person's data should be hidden. So how can we do it? Well, a recurring theme in cryptography and computer science is that randomization is a good tool for achieving privacy and secrecy. So it turns out that here too, randomization is a very useful tool, and a very simple way to achieve differential privacy is by introducing some random noise into your answers. So imagine, ask a query like a count, but I like to think of them as fractional counts. So what fraction of the data set is blood type B and HIV positive? Okay, just asking for a count. You can replace this with any other type of count that you're interested in. And the claim is that we can get differential privacy by taking the actual answer and adding some random noise to it, and adding a small amount of random noise. So why do we need only a small amount of random noise? Well, let's think of the effect of the one individual, of any one individual, individual's data on the on a count like this. So how much can changing one person's data change this answer?
It's going to depend on the size of the data set.
All right, it's going to depend on the size of the data set. So let's say we have n people in the data set. What's the most it can change the answer by?
It would be 1/6 at this particular time.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So yeah, 1/6, but in general, 1 in n,
Right.
1 over n. Okay, and so if we add enough noise of magnitude a bit larger than 1 over n, that should be enough intuitively to drown out the effect of any one individual. Okay. Yes, Slim.
But if I want to know the mean of the data and I know the sample that me and Bill Gates and some college student and it is income, then if the person is Bill Gates, then the mean.
Yeah, yeah, great. All right, great. You're right on. So that's why in a simple example, and I think when Kobe gets to his technical presentation, he will start getting at issues like what you're saying. So I talked about just counts where each person is contributing either 0 or 1, and then you divide by n. If you talk about averages of real values, then you care about the range of the values, and the amount of noise you add has to depend on this range as well. And if your range is so big because you want to support really big outliers like Bill Gates, then it's inherent that if you want to be able to kind of hide Bill Gates's salary from an average, you're going to have to add a huge amount of noise. And in some sense, that's inherent with trying to protect privacy. That if you want to be able to protect outliers, then you may be forced to deal with it that way. The other way is you don't care about the value of outliers. All right, so then you might do a mean of some truncated values. All right, we'll cap all the salaries at some reasonable value. Okay, and so sure, some people in the population, like Bill Gates, will not. We won't have an accurate reflection of them, and you get a reasonable average on the rest.
Yes, so usually to get the meaningful data in the usual sample, we usually get rid of the outliers. Then we first need to know which one is the outlier.
Great. All right. So these are all great. You're hitting right on really interesting issues that are probably too technical to get into in this presentation, but over the next couple of meetings, these are the kinds of issues we'll be talking about. Like, what's the right way? In fact, we've been grappling with exactly this problem when it comes to regression. Right? It's well understood how to do it sort of for means, but for regression, we've been grappling with this issue of sort of, what's a safe way to remove outliers. Great questions. All right. Good. All right. So let's go back to the simple example. The point is that we only need to drown out this effect of 1 over n. And so as your data gets large, as n goes to infinity, the amount of noise that you're introducing to this fractional answer is going to 0. All right. And so for big data context, as you have large data sets, you're introducing vanishingly small error into fractional counts like this. Okay. So so that's good. So there's two sort of important points or caveats. So one is that differential privacy is really tailored kind of to a setting where we're talking about large data sets. They don't necessarily have to be huge, but if you're talking about a survey of a few dozen, 6 people certainly, or a few dozen people, differential privacy is probably not the right tool. It's not going to be compatible with getting good utility. And another is really, we're talking about revealing population level information. So if your if you're really interested in, your query is kind of targeting some small portion of the population in the information you're trying to extract, like people with some rare disease, then this noise that's kind of vanishing with 1 over n may still be too much, or may be hiding a value you're interested in.
You answered
Ellie?
the question.
Oh, great. All right, another issue is that this is only talking about answering as is one query. And what if we, I mean, of course we don't want just people to be able to ask one count and say, oh, so you're done, that's all I'm going to tell you about the data, right? This model we have in mind is people could come and ask many questions. And that's a really important thing to investigate, and it's subject to a lot of investigation in differential privacy. So first, there are composition theorems for differential privacy, which quantify how the privacy degrades as more questions are asked. Okay, as you answer more queries with differential privacy, and you can compensate. So if someone asks many queries, you can provide the same level of privacy protection by just scaling up overall, by scaling up your noise appropriately. Okay, depending on how many queries you want to be able to support. However, this basic approach, if you try to just increase your noise so that you can answer more queries, so that each one has more privacy, so in total you have the kind of a fixed amount of privacy overall, that basic approach is going to be limited to answering a quadratic number of, like, about n squared queries. Right? If you want to answer more than that, you can't just treat each query separately on its own, right? And you have to do something more clever. Right? But it turns out there are more clever things that you can do where you take into account the queries that have been asked before and how you answer a new one, and don't treat each one independently. And I'll mention some of those types of results later.
For every user.
Great question.
They could sign up multiple times and.
Yes. So this is also exactly an issue that we're, so if you're really sort of a privacy paranoid person, you'd say, okay, all the users are like one monolithic adversary that might collude with each other and try to extract information from the data set, and I got to treat them as one user. Okay. But that's problematic because you have then one budget of queries for lots of users. The first user comes, asks a bunch of queries, and then no one else can ask anything left. So that's not very satisfactory from a utility point of view. So approach we're thinking about taking is for users that have like registered accounts on Dataverse, and then you can have some level of trust in them, you get them to agree that they won't collude with each other. Okay, and so that each user on its own has a privacy budget associated with them, a number of queries they can answer effectively. And it may be that we have protections. If one of these users turns out to be bad, differential privacy will give you protection. And what the case we're sort of assuming won't happen is that you have a large collection of these users that get together and try to pull out information.
Is it possible to like store the queries and then always return like the same value every time each user asks, like if they were asking the same query?
Great. So, all right. So the biggest, the way to see the problem with answering many queries, the simplest way to see it is exactly what you described. So the simplest problem is someone comes and asks the same query many times. And each time I say, okay, I'll give you the answer plus some random noise. I'll give you the answer plus some random noise. I'll give you the answer plus some random noise. And if you think about this for a bit, well, over time I can then average these results and the noise will start to cancel out. Okay, the random noise that I'm adding. And a solution to that specific attack is what you described. That you can store the answer to the previous queries and always give the same answer. You don't freshly add random noise. The reason this is not a kind of satisfactory solution in general is you can have queries that are effectively the same, but don't look the same. Okay, you can have the same queries in disguise. Or you can have queries that are related to each other in some way, and that from the noisy answers to them, you could somehow cancel out the noise, and it may not be easy for the system to tell that this is possible. Okay, and that's why you need some really more sophisticated approaches to dealing with this problem. But great question. All right, So that's the simplest approach to differential privacy. So now let me be a little bit more precise on the, not completely formal here, but how one makes this, give you a taste of how one makes this concept of differential privacy mathematically precise. All right, so again, we have this randomized interface answering queries on the data. Randomized, we saw in the example, that's going to inject its own random noise in order to protect privacy. Right? And the requirement is for any two data sets that differ on one row, right? So you imagine, like we had before, the data set D with your data in it, a data set D, any data set D prime that differs on, on your data, that has arbitrary other values replaced, and any sequence of queries that comes in that an adversary might ask, the distribution of answers that the adversary sees on your database D, all right, this is kind of over the randomness of this interface, should be approximately the same as the distribution of answers that the adversary sees on database D prime. Okay, and these probability distributions being close means that no matter how much computing power the adversary has, no matter what other auxiliary information it has, it can't distinguish the results on D from the results on D prime. It can't distinguish the world with your data in the data set from a world in which your data was removed or changed arbitrarily. And there's this parameter epsilon that you'll probably hear often, which measures how close these distributions are required to be, which is your measure of privacy protection. The smaller epsilon is, the more your privacy is protected. Right. It matters, right, and this is where I'm being informal here, exactly how you measure the closeness of these distributions. That choice matters in sort of having a definition that fits with the kind of intuitive interpretations we want. But I'll leave that for Kobe's more technical presentation. All right, so I gave one example of how you answer kind of counts with differential privacy. But there's now a huge literature, constantly growing, showing that wide variety of data analysis methods, including most of the ones that, many of the types of things that one does in practice in data science, are compatible with differential privacy, right? At least theoretically, in the same sense that I said before, that as n goes to infinity, as your data set gets larger and larger, the accuracy or utility or inferential properties of the differentially private analysis approach that of the analysis you would do without any privacy protections. All right, so I think maybe I'll skip going through more detailed interpretations of I think I said enough about these things. Maybe just two caveats here. So Micah mentioned sometimes we are not our concern is not just the protection of individuals in a data set, but we might be concerned about protecting some subpopulations, some protected groups. And differential privacy is really about protecting individual level information, and the way it captures individual level information in its basic application is knowing that one individual's data is like one row in your data set. Okay? And so if you have a large population, subpopulation that you want to protect as a whole, differential privacy in its basic form won't do it. Or if you have data about an individual that's spread throughout the entire data set. Like everyone, a picture of me, embarrassing picture of me went viral, and it's on everyone's wall. Okay, and so every row in the data set has this embarrassing picture of me. Differential privacy is not going to protect it because it's not localized to a single or a small number of rows in the data. And the second important point is there's no guarantee that the subjects won't be harmed by the result of using this interface. And the reason for that is, all right, so the interface is designed to teach things, for people to learn information about the population. And who knows what crazy decisions someone might take or actions they may take based on what they learn. Right? So at some point we learned that smoking is correlated with lung cancer, and then now smoking is banned in all kinds of public places, and smokers might claim that they were harmed by people being able to study this correlation. Right? But the point is, and what differential price is, they weren't harmed because of their own data. Right? In some sense, their data wasn't being used against them. It was a fact about the population that led to a decision that they found harmful. And I think it's a general principle in kind of the handling of like scholarly research that you don't worry about those kind of harms, the ones that come from the knowledge that's gained, the scientific knowledge that's gained as a result of study. So that's even in the common rule, this federal regulation that governs human subjects research has a specific statement along those lines, that it's not the responsibility of researchers to worry about those kind of harms. All right, so I just want to wrap up with, just to give you a taste of at least one amazing possibility of what's possible in principle with differential privacy. So until now, I maybe also a quick demo. Let's see how we're doing on time. I don't want to keep us from lunch for too long. So before I talked about differentially private interfaces answering one query at a time. We have this kind of mediating access to the data. I said we're not going to try to release an anonymized version of the data set. But it turns out that in principle it is possible to do something analogous to a one-shot release with differential privacy. In particular, there are results saying that we can produce in a differentially private way a synthetic data set, all right, that reflects many of the statistical properties of the original data. All right, so the difference from this from an anonymous is this is not an anonymized data set where the rows here have any one-to-one correspondence with the original data. What you release is a fake data set. These are each fake people, but somehow this data set as a whole has been constructed in a way that reflects a huge amount of statistical information about the original data. Okay? And yet it satisfies this strong privacy protection that no one person's data has a detectable influence on the synthetic data that's produced. Okay? And in fact, it's known that you can, as I said, preserve a huge number of statistical properties. So if I have some number of attributes, D, that's small compared to N, the number of people in the data set, every combination of these attributes, the fraction of the synthetic data set that has people with that fraction of those attributes is approximately the same as in the original. So the fraction of the people that are male and blood type O is approximately the same in the synthetic data set as in the original. The fraction that are, blood type B and HIV negative and male also will be approximately the same in both. All right, so this is a theoretical result. A major challenge is there are computational complexity barriers that we've spent a lot of time working on here, and in making this efficient, in making it computationally efficient enough to use in practice, as well as, again, the asymptotics, like trying to make it work well for N that's not huge, but more reasonable. But actually some of the work this summer, yes?
I say, if you were going to do the synthetic data, wouldn't you do that for sort of do that one generation of that synthetic data set, like when it was put into the database? Like we wouldn't need to constantly resynthesize the data once you created a suitable set. So.
Yes, but the computational complexity, at least of the initial algorithms to do this, is so high, it's exponential in the number of variables.
Right. And
so once you hit, say, 50 variables, you can't even run it once.
Gotcha.
Right?
Okay.
even running the algorithm once would take more than the lifetime of the universe using our fastest computers now.
Yeah. Alright.
For when the number of dimensions is I don't know, somewhere in the 50 to 100 range. Now there are better approaches for this, and in fact, one of the projects this summer, actually, Lim, the things you're working on, contingency tables, is one of the approaches to doing this better. All right, and there's also some amazing possibilities, some very general results about doing statistical and inference and machine learning. I kind of hinted at what kind of things you can get. That again, as n goes to infinity, the inferential properties and the convergence rates are approaching that, are similar to that of what you would have without privacy. But there are again challenges in making these theoretical results practical. One of the most prominent here is that, again, n is not going to infinity in practice. You need things to work for data sets of actual that researchers are actually collecting and dealing with.
I'm assuming the small data problem also applies to if you're looking at a big data set with, I don't know, millions of entries, but you're looking at a subset, so you can't figure out what n is, but the data is too small to have the same, I guess, amount of noise added to it as in the big data set.
Great question. So yes and no. You can gain from knowing that your data set is a random sample of a big population. It does help in differential privacy. That as long as no one has announced and published somewhere who was sampled in the data set, that information is kept secret, then the fact that it was a small sample actually boosts the privacy protections of differential privacy, and as a result allows you to add less noise than you would before. Still, it's not quite as good as having the whole original data set, and we don't have a full understanding of kind of how much you gain in practice from that. But actually, one of the tools, the one I'm about to demonstrate, does. I think not the version I'm demonstrating, but it actually takes exactly that into account. So you're all asking perfect questions. All right, let's see, some of these are relevant for, this question came up already. Other challenges, people aren't used to only having access to data through an interface. And people who are, practicing researchers are used to being able to look at the data, right, and explore it arbitrarily and not only be allowed to ask some specific set of queries. Not to mention, having noise added to those queries and saying, okay, that's the only kind of access you're going to get. So the approach we're taking, which is one that's used elsewhere, like by Census, is that we imagine the role of differential privacy is to provide wide but rough access to the data, so that you can make available to a fairly wide population the ability to get statistical information about the data. And this hopefully will give people enough information to know whether it's worth going to the trouble to apply for access to the raw data, which is, at least right now, a much more cumbersome process, which we also hope to make more efficient in the project. So that's one point, and another one is thinking about utility. As I hinted, differential privacy is meant to support statistical analysis. In some cases, where you want to pick out an individual for a drug study or something like that, your utility is not about statistical properties, it's about identifying an individual, and differential privacy won't let you do that on purpose, right? And so it's not the right fit if that's your goal. And I've mentioned before, we were thinking about how to match it with law and regulation. I think there's reason for hope with all of these challenges. There are a lot of efforts going on around the world to bring differential privacy to practice, including here in this project. I think what distinguishes our efforts from the others, one is that we're trying to do things that are more general purpose than what most of the efforts are trying to do. That you have people coming with arbitrary data sets and uploading to Dataverse, and we want to have a tool that can enable them to make differentially private access available, as opposed to experts, differential privacy experts, thinking really hard about, for this particular data set, what's the best way to do release on it, and on a case-by-case basis needing experts involved at every for every data set and every release. And it's related to we want it to be kind of really as automated as possible. Again, a non-expert should be able to use the tool. And then I mentioned we're taking this tiered access approach, which is also different from the other efforts. So maybe I'll just wrap up with just playing this. Gary, do you have a few minutes to?
Yeah.
All right, I'm almost done. Show this demo of the tool that Jack and others have been working on. So this is something this is a mock-up of what an uploader who's uploading a data set would go through to decide initially about summary statistics of the data set to make available publicly. So selecting individual variables here from the data set. This is from the same census data set that James was showing yesterday. This is the variable. Let's go back actually on the video. I didn't practice with the timing on it. Is some basic properties of what that variable is, and then what kind of statistic do you want to release? The histogram, some estimation of its quantiles or its CDF, approximation of the mean, information about the variable that's needed, what level of privacy protection, and what kind of accuracy on the estimate does that correspond to? All right, and so it's to, of course, this will all come with more instructions, but this is supposed to help a user decide how to allocate this privacy budget among many different statistics that they want to release. Right now, this is for the uploader to go through. And now when someone comes to explore the data set, a later user of Dataverse, they will see these summary statistics that James showed you yesterday, except now these will be differentially private summary statistics. Okay, they're ones that are safe to release according to the privacy criteria of differential privacy. And one thing that's not here yet, and also one of the projects I think Jessica will be working on this summer, is adding to this visualization of the errors that have been introduced into these statistics with differential privacy. Caper?
Is there accountability for, I guess, negligent researchers who don't add enough private, don't add enough noise, I guess, to the initial upload to the data set? So if they are, I guess, just not responsible.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess our law team will be the ones to make some final recommendations along those lines. But I think, in general, the philosophy of the tools is to push ultimate responsibility on, say, the data depositor. Already, they have to certify when they upload a data set without these privacy controls that it's safe to upload and there aren't confidentiality concerns. And if they lie about that, well, then they're taking responsibility for that decision. And similarly, if we give them some guidance on what's a safe level of privacy protection, they say, oh no, I don't want to use that. I'll use some much weaker privacy protection. That's somehow their responsibility.
So it's traceable backwards, right?
The person who's uploading the data, yes, I think that's Dataverse knows who they are. And, yes. All right, so that's the tool where we are now. But there's a bunch of things that we're trying to do. So that's really non-interactive. Only the data depositor is deciding what statistics to compute in a differentially private manner. One of the things where we want to move is to this interactive model, which is the model that I showed you, where people can come with their own queries and get differentially private answers. Okay, and so that's the next step, and is a big step this summer. Allie's going to be working on things related to that. I talked about visualization. Another big thing is testing how useful all of this is for the end social science user and for this use case that we want to support of helping people decide whether a data set is of interest to them. And then supporting more sophisticated statistics than we currently handle. We're doing a lot of thinking and work around supporting basic regressions. I mentioned contingency table work, and as well as working on how this will integrate with Dataverse. And there's also a project around understanding better the practicality of some of the attacks that I mentioned on aggregate data, on statistics that motivated the development of differential privacy. And it's also a project of a student that I guess is working mostly in the evenings, so you won't see him. But maybe you'll hear about some of the work that he's doing. Okay, so I think I don't need to repeat all of these things. I think there's a lot of promise in differential privacy. Certainly challenges in bringing it to practice, but that's part of the mission here of the project, is to see how far we can push it. Questions? You all asked great questions along the way. All right. Well, you'll be hearing more about this as the summer goes on, and if you're interested in seeing really the technical meat of it, that will be right after lunch with Kobe. It's great that Gary King, who I mentioned yesterday, was able to pop out of the Dataverse community meeting briefly to say hello to all of us. Gary, I don't know, did you want to say anything about kind of how this project sort of fits into the space of things Dataverse is?
I'm just hungry.
Where's our lunch?
It's outside in the kitchen area, so we can grab a plate and bring it in, or I can bring everything in.
Okay, great. And would it be useful for you or do you want to get lunch first? Or I was thinking, do you want to go around and find out who's who? Why don't we do just a quick round of introductions? I'm sorry, it'll also help me. I've been looking for an excuse since I missed it.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I just finished my undergraduate degree at Harvard in government and computer science.
I'm Aaron Benbenek. I'm a special student in computer science here.
I'm Allie Kaminsky. I'm a computer science major at Wake Forest.
Grant Nelson, a law student, studied in the Berkman Center as Rights and Tools team.
Patrick Moore, University of Washington Law. James Grant.
Hi, Sandra, same as these two. Alexander Wood, a fellow at the Berkman Center. Michelle, visiting scientist at MIT. Moema, visiting scientist at MIT.
Marco Gavardi, visiting scholar, Circus.
John Shaw, Harvard Magazine.
Steve Chong, computer scientist.
Ron Kamkamian at the Berkman Center at Boston.
I got personally introduced.
Or just for the postdoc at computer science.
Mark Bunn, grad student in computer science.
Thomas, same. I'm Jack, research assistant, soon to be graduate student with Salil.
I guess we should continue right this way.
Community computer scientist.
Michael Altman, social information scientist, MIT Libraries.
Kimia Mavon, project coordinator.
Ryan, I'm a PhD student at visiting for the summer.
I'm Cameron, I'm a computer science major from Michigan State.
I'm Dan. I study economics, politics, and Chinese at UMass Lowell.
I'm Hao Cheng, computer science and math major here.
I'm Lim from UCLA, I'm political science major.
Andrea Antuca from University of Essex, where I studied economics and politics.
I'm Jessica, I study computer science and French at Wellesley College.
I'm Kiefer. I study economics, international relations, and Arabic at William and Mary.
Wow.
Yeah, so we have a really great group of disciplines here represented among the students. So why don't we get lunch, and then we can chat informally over lunch.
All